Hello, and welcome to Nerdverse Unshuffled, a geeky podcast where we introduce you to the language of board games. We are your hosts, Jacques van Heerden and Fayyaad and Jacques. Welcome back to part 2 of the episode. Last time we stopped just as we were getting to phases. So what we did cover was rounds, turns, and actions.
Correct.
One thing we still need to look at is phases, and then we also do need to look at reactions, which is a special kind of action. And we're going to be looking at a lot of different exceptions to all of the rules and all of the terminology that we've discussed so far.
Yes, because if it was easy, it would be fun, right?
Yeah, and we're going to get into some examples and see how looking at specific games kind of helps us figure this stuff out. But anyway, so let's begin like we usually do with a little light reading. This time the section about phases.
Okay, cool. So in games with more complex round constructions, and they can get complex, it's often helpful to split rounds into phases during which players may or must perform certain actions. So, as an example, you've got Arch and the Consortium, a game about people vying for the chair of the Arts Chancellor at a magical university, and the game's got 3 phases in a single round. Okay, and the game takes place over 5 rounds. So, in the first phase, it's called Setup. Everyone simultaneously undoes the effects on the previous round. So we take back characters, we reset cards, we reset spells, basically set the game back to a playable state so that the game can begin for the next round. Then you've got the errands phase. That's where players go around the table taking turns, placing their workers and placing their little figures on the board. And then you've got the third phase, which is the resolution phase, where everyone kind of carries out the actions of what they've decided to do in the game. And in Argent the Consortium was a particular, one round is one run through all the phases. Right, so it muddies the waters of what we defined in the last episode, where we said you got actions, you got turns, you got rounds. In this case, we've got actions, turns, phases, rounds.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's look at the other example that I've been using, the game Seven Wonders, right? Mm-hmm. Seven Wonders has no phases, again, because it's got 3 different. Everyone plays simultaneously. There's no phase for anything to happen in, and sometimes this is going to be confusing. A game is going to use the term phase for a unit of time that's larger than a round. So you'll have going down from small to big. It's actions, turns, rounds, phases, instead of the other way around. So just in case you weren't confused enough by which one. But the fact that these are used interchangeably as to mean 2 different sets of things, it's just considered the phase as a grouping of something, as a way to group a whole bunch of either rounds or a whole bunch of actions together.
Okay. Yeah. So it does seem from that description you gave now that phases differ from rounds, mostly because phases can be used in very, very loosely.
Yeah.
The idea that the hierarchy can switch between rounds and phases makes that definition very tricky. It's very hard to say what a phase consists of if it can consist of these 2 separate things, and it can get very confusing.
No, absolutely. So in the case of Argent the Consortium, for example, right, the definitions we had for round also don't make quite the same amount of sense as we did before. So because what it means now is that a round is over once all the phases have been run through. It does get confusing because there are, sometimes you got these rounds that contain phases, and sometimes you have phases that contain rounds. But thankfully, within a particular game, it doesn't change. If the
Yes.
game says this is how it's set up, it's not going to be changing during the course of the game, thankfully.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, if you are ever confused during a game, there is the game manual that should have an explanation of each of these terms.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it'll have a glossary at the back somewhere where it'll give you an easy way to reference, and it'll say what a phase is, and it'll say what a round is, if those exist in the game.
I wish all of them did.
It doesn't always,
Yeah.
but if you do find yourself getting confused, just it might be worth actually just making a note somewhere and just maybe write it on a piece of paper and just stick it in the game box.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's no universally correct answer for every game.
Exactly.
I mean, phases are tricky because they can comprise many rounds. One round can contain many phases, etc., etc., etc.
And sometimes the game can have both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Power Grid is the example of a game that's got bidding phases, you've got building phases, you've got activating phases, but each phase has its own complete round structure, right? So you've got once you start the bidding phase, everyone goes bidding around the table, and once the power plants are all picked up, that's the end of the bidding phase. But one round is everyone going around bidding on the power plant once. And then you've got the building phase, and then everyone goes around the table building stuff, and then everyone goes on. But all of this together, one run through each of the phases, is still a round. It's crazy. And Power Grid, we're going to get back to again under the exceptions because there is a bit more to it than this, but we'll come back to that one.
Yeah. So just one note before we continue.
Yeah.
So Power Grid is one of the more complex games that we're going to be discussing in this episode.
Yeah.
So that's also something to just keep in mind. So not every game is going to make it this complicated. Like again, Zombie Dice, very simple.
Ticket to Ride, simple.
Ticket to Ride. There are very fun, enjoyable, great games that don't quite get into the reads quite as much as this.
Yeah.
But we also don't want to give you the unfair idea that this is simple.
This is but then again, you don't want to get into the idea that for example, what Power Grid does is normal.
No,
because it isn't.
It is not. Not even for complicated games.
Yeah.
Some complicated games have a very simple round structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look at Champions of Midgard, for example, right? Or even Chimera Station. There are a specific number of rounds. This game's going to take place over 7-8 rounds. Like I said, even like Hydrogen and Consortium, there are 6 rounds. It's 5 rounds, and the game's over. That's what you're going to be playing through. But even then, within the rounds, there are phases within each round. So like Champions of Midgard, for example, you've got the placing your workers phase, and then there's the combat phase in each round.
Okay, so I mean, in my experience, I'm definitely more likely to confuse rounds and phases when we're playing a game than any of these other terms. So again, coming back to Arkham Horror, that also uses both rounds and phases. So It's the second edition by Richard Launius and Kevin Wilson, because I haven't played the other 2 editions. So it's basically gameplay happens over a set of rounds, each of which is divided into 5 phases. So there's the upkeep phase, player movement, Arkham encounters, Otherworld encounters, and then there's the Mythos phase.
Yeah.
So the number of phases is always the same, but players don't need to do something in each phase, and each game can take any number of rounds.
Yeah.
So, that's also a different kind of complexity that game sort of adds in. But then also players need to perform some actions in specific phases and not in others. So that's why phases in that game is an important term, because it explains, okay, so bad stuff can happen in phase 1, phase 3, and phase 4, but this particular bad thing can't happen in phase 3, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
So this bad thing only happens in phase 4.
Actually, another good example of a game that uses those phases, that phase construction, but we simplify it down to two players. Magic the Gathering, right? Each
Yeah,
turn you've got. In fact, this is the only time where I've seen phase happens at the level lower than a turn, because
oh,
you've
right.
got you've got one player turn. You run through all the phases: upkeep, untap,
That's right.
actions, cleanup.
Right.
I think there were 5 phases,
Yeah, I
but
can't remember how many there are, but yeah.
but then again, the concept of a round doesn't make sense in Magic the Gathering. Oh, no, it does. It's once
No.
once both players are
Well,
gone. That's one round.
yeah,
But we don't keep track of that because it's literally just my turn, your turn
yeah.
until someone is defeated.
That's an
But
interesting example of
yeah.
phases. Um, Actually, the other game I was going to talk about as well, because there is this idea of simultaneous actions that we talked about in the last bit. But there are also games where there's a certain part of your turn that you can take while everybody else is going.
Yeah.
Like everybody else is doing their turn, so then you're doing part of your turn while everybody else is going. Well, I mean that does actually set us up very nicely for reactions. So let's actually go straight to it.
Correct. So let's go there. So a reaction is quite literally something that you do during someone else's turn, and it often interrupts another player's action. So it allows you to, respond to what some other player is doing in some way, or form or function. Depending on the game, sometimes you're told, you need to finish the player who's actually playing needs to finish what they're doing before your interruption can go. And sometimes, it stops the action and your interruption happens and then they've got to, finish it off. And let's go back to Magic the Gathering where players can go back and forth, interrupting and reacting to each other's
Yeah,
card plays over and over again until everyone's like run out of cards to play or decided I'm not doing anything further. And then you
yeah,
resolve these reactions downwards on the stack. But it does get confusing. And so a lot of games have structures in place to contain that action reaction sort of, what's the word I'm looking for?
um, interchange, exchange.
For that exchange, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems something that happens a lot in card games. Like
Yeah.
it is something you see very often. I know it happens in Smash Up. You can have a thing you play as a reaction. Like, no, you can't do that. Or, oh, you can
Yeah.
do that, but then I'm going to do this.
Exactly, right?
And you're going to choose not to do what you're doing, or you're going to change what you're doing,
Yeah.
or you're just going to regret making that particular choice.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to those exceptions because yeah.
Yes. All the lovely, lovely exceptions. What would our hobby be without all the exceptions, Fayyaad?
Absolutely. So what you're going to find is that most games you're going to be kept within either round action or round turn action. Whether one of the simpler constructions, not going to be all too complicated. But sometimes a game needs to keep track of something larger than phases or for larger than rounds where we've used rounds and phases and turns and we've used all of it and now we need to do something bigger than this, right? And literally all this timekeeping is so that you don't have that you minimize the chaos
Yeah.
where chaos isn't warranted. I mean, if you're not playing something like Happy Salmon where it's pure chaos, then you don't care. But
You had to bring up Happy Salmon.
more often than not, you want there to be an ordered progress because everyone wants to feel like they've had their fair chance to play or to react to something. right? And this doesn't even bring me to we're not even talking about real-time games because that's a whole mess of its own.
Yeah, that's a separate episode. That's a whole separate episode all on its own. Much, much later.
But what you're going to find is that as board gaming as a hobby has matured and it's really grown into its own over the past decade or so, a lot of times it used to be conflated with each other. For example, you'd use round and phase interchangeably, or one game would use phase where it meant round, or one game would use round where it meant phase, or what. A lot of that has kind of sorted itself out as more regularity and more structure has come to rulebooks. And people have started understanding, okay, this is actually what we mean by these timekeeping terms. But that said, right, some games are going to demand a whole bunch of other terms because
Yes.
it's a more complicated game. So
Yeah.
let's go back to Power Grid again, right? Because
Okay. I've actually also got an example as well.
yeah, right. So Power Grid has we spoke that it's got phases. You've got rounds, and the round contains phases, and the phases contain rounds, and those rounds contain turns, right? But even worse than that, Power Grid has something called a step, because all the other words were already used. So it needed something,
Right.
but it needs something bigger. So basically, a step is at a certain point in the game where some trigger happens, then the game has gone into step 2, and then when another trigger happens, it's now step 3, and then the game's over, right? But
Right.
it still has those rounds and phases within each set of within each step. It's crazy. Look at Mage Knight, the Mage Knight board game, because Mage Knight's its own complex beast because it used to be a
Yes.
toy line. But the Mage Knight board game, right,
Yes.
has a structure called a day, and it makes sense thematically within the game that the players are exploring this land and you're going through days and nights, but during each day, and we call the night day as well, players perform actions and turns, and there are phases within it as well. And we're not even going to get into the way combat works in that game. It's crazy. But you need something bigger than phases or rounds to talk about, in this case, thematic it works, to talk about how the time is structured in the game. And then you just look at another example, Betrayal at House on the Hill, right? Where you've got the players exploring this haunted house, and there are phases within each turn, right?
Yes.
But then on top of that, there's a point during which the game changes dramatically from exploring the haunted house to surviving what's coming out at you.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
they call that the haunt scenario. But scenario is a term used in other games to mean something else entirely. So
Yes.
Betrayal at House on the Hill is a bit of an odd duck in that regard.
Yeah. Actually, the example that I was going to use is a game that you haven't played yet, I don't think, which is Zaya.
Oh, yes, Legend of a Div System.
Yes. So in that case, what you're looking at is actually a game where you've got your turn as a player consists of
Yeah.
several phases.
Okay. So like Magic the Gathering.
Yeah. Where the complexity for that game comes in is that your action phase you perform sequentially. But then once you've finished your action phase, you go into the business phase followed by your status phase. And your business phase and your status phase, you can actually continue playing while the next player is taking their action phase.
Okay.
And the reason that game does it is because otherwise it'll take you a day to play this
play the whole
game
game. Fair enough.
because the turns take so long. So that's just one way of
Yeah.
speeding up gameplay around the table, but it does
Yeah.
make that thing a little bit complex because your turn continues while somebody else's turn has
It's
begun.
begun, yes.
But it's still it's not simultaneous. It's actually still sequential.
Yeah. So I'm just talking about going back to reactions, right? In Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy, the reactions are only available to you once you've passed. So just because you've passed your turn doesn't mean you've stopped playing for the round. You can still react to what other people are doing, but it still costs you to do so. So you got to think, do I actually want to do this?
So I think that kind of gets us to the main point of these episodes, which is figuring out how this jargon helps us.
Yeah.
And I think in this case, this is also where we might be able to get into a little bit of the history. I mean, we've discussed this already throughout the course of the episodes, but just exactly how this language has changed over time.
Yeah.
And obviously, you wrote this series of articles at a specific point in time, and we're recording these episodes in a specific point in time.
Correct.
But that doesn't mean that all these terms will continue to mean the same thing. I mean, it does seem to be. It does seem to be getting slightly more consistent.
Yeah.
But then also not.
But more often consistent than not, right? I've seen in more recent games very little deviation from that, from what we now consider the norm of. It's only phases that really mess with everything because they could exist at so many different levels.
All those terms are sort of nebulous and kind of like, okay, well, we're going to now use the word scenario in this way that no other game uses it. We're going to introduce a very thematic thing like day.
Yeah. You're going to use step, which implies a sequence of steps that you follow, but actually isn't.
Yeah.
So I mean, the term that you're looking for where the meanings of words change over time, it's called semantic drift.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, what does make it confusing, right, is that board games are, how do I put it? They are temporal. They're a product of their time. So, like a game of, Pit, for example, it was made in 1903. It still holds up really, really well, to the modern sensibilities. But if you look at games that were developed like in the 1970s, 1980s, right? They're going to use, occasionally, sometimes they use the terms in a different way to what you expect. And you just need to be aware that there might not be as much conformity as we'd like.
I think, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think the most useful way to think of all these terms is just as words that we use to structure how gameplay goes around a table between players. It defines how players interact with each other and with the components.
And it's literally just to prevent the entire thing from falling into chaos.
Yeah. I mean, even in those very chaotic games where, there is a lot of, cross-talk or activity or things don't quite, work in a sequential, like step-based way, the game is still organized. It's still an organized activity.
Absolutely.
So there's a way of telling when something begins and when something has ended.
Yeah.
When an important decision needs to be made.
Yeah.
Or, when a dramatic shift is occurring during the course of gameplay. I mean, I think also, like as you were saying, just like being conscious of when a game came out and maybe just realizing, okay, well, when I'm reading the rule book, these are maybe terms I should be on the lookout for, but they'll probably be confusing on some level.
Yeah.
Or they'll be confusing to somebody because somebody will have played one particular game, that uses it in the term in one way, and this game uses it in a different way.
Yeah.
Even if the game itself is simple, just knowing that the complexity exists and knowing that it's not you,
Yeah.
like it's not you as a player who is confusing. It is the terminology that we are using that has it's shifted. It's a bit nebulous. It's a bit opaque.
But mostly it's solid, right? Because for the vast majority of games, right, you know that it's going to be everyone takes actions within their turns, and once everyone has had a single turn, that's a single round. That's the bog standard
Yeah,
for the vast majority of games, right? It's where the game time gets a bit more complicated, then you need to start paying attention to what you're doing. And quite often, a lot of the board games have structures in place that give you a visual on where things are, right?
yeah,
So let's go back to that example of Arch and Consortium. You know for a fact which round you're in because there's a deck of cards with the entire deck of cards. This is the numbers 1, 2, and 5, and all they do is tell you
yeah,
what round it is, right? And you know when the upkeep phase is done because the game is back to a playable state
indeed.
at the start of the round. So no, okay, upkeep phase is done. Everyone's now ready to play, and you know that the actions phase is over because there's another deck of cards called the bell tower cards that when they're all taken indicate the end of the round. So
Yeah,
and it's not the only game that does this. A lot of games that have very clear signposting on when in the round we are, when in the phase, and for a lot of games that don't have signposts on the in the game itself, there's the little helper card or a helper player aid
yeah,
that has the phases and turns and actions listed for you, so that you can follow it down. Okay,
yeah,
so we've just done this. That means we must be finished with that phase. That means we're now going on to the next phase to do these and so.
yeah.
I think a lot of designers are aware that sometimes it does get a bit hairy inside the timekeeping, and so they do put structures in place to help players keep track of where we are in the midst of things.
Yes, I mean that. I think that what you're saying now is definitely true. I mean, even in a relatively simple game like Horrified, for example, which I love.
Yeah,
I mean, it's you. There aren't like a set number of rounds or whatever that that determine whether or not you've succeeded or
yeah,
failed. But there are ways of telling on the board, and based on what's happening with the different components, depending on what your setup is that you've chosen,
yeah,
like which monsters you're fighting or trying to defeat. You
exactly.
know, those all those components basically make it easier for you to track how the game is going or how far you've progressed. And then
Exactly.
also there are parts of that board that also tell you how close you are to losing.
Yeah, no,
And
that's
I
true.
think definitely, like when we talked about this in the mechanics episode, but I think that kind of that awareness of the cognitive load and possibly the complexity of the terms and concepts that people need to keep track of when they're playing a game. I
Yeah,
think a lot of the smarter board game designers are very conscious of that, and they've
yeah,
specifically put effort in to make the components help you out. So whether it's by
exactly.
adding those helper cards, or whether it's by adding a specific track on the board,
Yeah,
or
deck of cards.
like very clearly marking the difference between one set of cards and another. I think definitely as you keep playing more and more different games, you're gonna find that that is gonna make a big difference to you in terms of how easy it is to remember what you're doing,
Yeah,
to teach it to other people, and then also just to have fun.
absolutely. I mean, there's something I love talking about called the curse of knowledge, right? When we forget what it was like to be a beginner, you
Yes.
forget what it's like to not know something. And I ran into this experience this very weekend. I was teaching my dad to play Eclipse Second Dawn for the Galaxy. And it is a really, really complicated game. But it wasn't until I started explaining to him how to play that I realized, actually, my discussion, my explanation is taking like almost an hour, of how to do things, what things do. That I realized, for my dad to be taking this in, that's a lot to take in one short session.
Yeah.
But what we both appreciated a lot is that there are very good helper cards in Eclipse that tell you, what you're doing, where you are, and even when your turn is over, right? When you decide you're passing, you flip over your helper tile, because that tells you, okay, now you can do your reactions, and you place all your reactions on the tile.
Okay.
Instead of on your main board, so you don't forget that they're there to do. But that was really, really good graphic design on behalf of those guys. It was fantastic.
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely, I think that's just another reason to pay attention to that kind of information when you're maybe listening to a board game review, or when you're like just going through a book or through the rule book and kind of going like, well, how am I going to be explaining this to someone?
Exactly.
Like just keep that keep those questions in mind. Keep asking yourself whether you actually are clear on how this game uses it, and whether you can explain it to the person next to you, and also whether you'll remember it halfway through the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that's a lot on time in board games. We may have exceeded our allotted time. No, I was hoping we'd be able to make a lot more Doctor Who jokes, but
it's timey-wimey.
We have singularly failed, Fayyaad. Timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff. But no such luck. But so thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on various platforms and join the conversation on Discord. Links in the episode description wherever you found this podcast. You can find articles and discussions about the terms used in this podcast over at nerdverse.co.za. You can also find articles on a host of other subjects, including tabletop role-playing games, interviews, events, and how-tos. Your hosts were Jacques van Heerden and Fayyaad Hendricks. Music, editing, producer, Fayyaad Hendricks. Executive producer, Jacques van Heerden. Unshuffled is a Nerdverse Productions podcast.